So, hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Ritchey. I'm the owner of the Orthodox Design Company, which is a graphic design company here in Birmingham. We focus on design within the context of the church. So we do a lot of design for churches, church organizations, religious businesses and events and things like that. Graphic design and icons don't necessarily go hand in hand, but I've kind of weaved them together a little bit. A big part of my business is working with custom iconography. I'm not an icon painter myself, though I hope to be one day, but it's a really long process to learn, and so I want to be able to devote the time to it that it needs. But I do a lot of custom work in that I'll take icons that have already been made, and I'll remove elements of them or take the figures out of them and combine them into one icon, if it's the saints of two people that are married or something like that. So I do a lot of work with icons, and that sprung from two places. The first, I practically have the capabilities to do them because I know digital design software. And the other one, I have a really big fascination with icons and iconography, which I've had for quite some time, but it really kind of grew and sprung up a little bit when my parish, St. Simeon Orthodox Church, just down the street, when we had the icons installed in our parish on the walls. They're done by two incredible Romanian iconographers, and they do all of the work. They paint it all on canvas and then send it over and come over every couple of years and apply it all to the walls. But seeing all of a sudden all of these beautiful icons around me, I was like, man, I've got to know more about this. I've got to learn why all of these things are the way they are. So I have learned a lot of that, and I wanted to share it with you, and I've titled this presentation, Understanding Iconography, with the intent of giving you an idea of how the Orthodox understand iconography, how we use it in our daily lives, and also some of the theological reasoning behind everything. And before we get into the meat of it, I used two big references for this presentation. The first is this book. It's called The Icon Window onto the Kingdom by Michael Pinault. I think it's out of print, but you can find copies still on Amazon and eBay. It's a really, really good book. It's not very thick, but it goes through a very entry-level, it works through the history and then into the theology and the symbolism and whatnot. You can see all my notes there that I was taking as I was reading it. So I recommend this. I'll put it here so you can take a look at it in a little bit. And then another point of reference I had, especially for some of the technical aspects of iconography, was a good friend of mine, Georgia Briggs. She's an iconographer that we go to church with. She's also the author of an incredible young adult novel entitled Icon. And she's the iconographer of this icon here and this one here, so you can take a closer look at those in a little bit. But I spoke with her. Like I said, I'm not an iconographer myself, so I spoke with her to get a little bit more detail about how the iconographic process works. And the last thing, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So if any questions come up, jot them down or keep them in your head, and I'll hit them at the end. So to really understand icons, it's a really broad topic, but to begin to understand them, we have to understand what beauty is. Now, we live in a world where imagery reigns supreme. We're constantly looking at images on social media, on TV. We're sending them back and forth. We can take pictures so quickly with our phones, which is much different from the world even 10 years ago, and certainly decades and decades before that. So a quick Google search of beauty brings up a couple of images similar to this. Now, there's nothing not beautiful about any of these, right? They're beautiful. But is this really the epitome of beauty? Is this really the peak of beauty? It's what Google says the peak of beauty is, at least the first 4 searches are. But in order for us to really understand beauty, we have to look at it through the eyes of the church and within the context of God, because God is beauty itself. In Greek, the word philokalia is the love of beauty. And it's an innate feeling that we all have. I mean, think about when you see something that you consider beautiful. It fills you with joy. It makes you smile. It makes you laugh. God does that for us because He is beauty itself. So we can only understand the true beauty of everything through God. And icons are inherently beautiful because they speak about God who became man, so that man might be transfigured into the divine, or might become gods with little g's, not big G's, gods by grace. So it's important to recognize that as beautiful as icons are, they are not just a thing of beauty. I don't know where my image went there, sorry. And to reduce the icon to simply art is proof of a misunderstanding of the principal role of an icon. To truly understand the icon, it requires an understanding of its vocabulary and its syntax. So we have to look at its history, its components, and its place in our everyday lives. It's a unity of artistic, spiritual, and theological nature. So let's look at the history of icons. St. Luke, according to tradition, painted the first icon of the Virgin Mary. This one, we call her in Orthodox the theotokos, a Greek word that means birth giver of God. This is one that is sometimes attributed to him. Now, whether or not he is actually the first icon painter, the first iconographer, is up for debate. Some people claim that this was a theory invented during the period of Iconoclasm to help defend the icons and kind of get people on the side of the icons. Some people argue that there's no way any icon that existed back then would still exist today because of things like Iconoclasm when icons were being destroyed. Either way, whether or not St. Luke is actually the first iconographer in the painting on wood sense, he really is the first iconographer to a degree because he paints us a visual image with words. He paints a verbal icon of the Virgin Mary because he's the one that speaks about her the most in his Gospels. But if he is truly the first iconographer, if he really did paint the first icons, and we're going to accept his pictures made with paint and ink on wood, we're going to accept his writings made with ink on paper. Why would we not accept his paintings made on wood? Another origin of icons, so to speak, the first true icon is called the archieropitos. It's called the holy napkin, the image not made with hands, or the mandilion. The Orthodox tradition, this is an iconographic representation of it. The Orthodox tradition tells us about King Akbar of Edessa, who was sick, and he had heard of Christ and believed in him, and he wanted to see him. But Christ was drawing near to his passion, and he wasn't going to be able to fulfill the king's wishes. So he asked for a cloth and some water, and he washed his face, and Christ's face, the image of his face, remained on the cloth miraculously. This was sent to King Akbar, and it healed him. And the icon, that image, has a really rich history in itself. It stayed in Edessa for a while. It was covered up during the reign of the Iconoclasts so that it wouldn't be destroyed. It moved to Constantinople at one point, and the church actually remembers that every year on August 16th, the moving of that icon. And there's another copy of the iconographic version of the Mandilion over there that you can look at as well. Now, the Western tradition tells us about Saint Veronica, who on the way to Christ's passion washed his face and the miraculous image was on there. That is not what the Orthodox tends to uphold, but either way, this is one of the very first, if not the very first icons. It is the image of Christ that proved to be miraculous and garnered veneration for many years. So jumping to the Old Testament gives us an idea of where the beginnings of the icon came from. The Jews rejected any kind of divine representation because of the law given to Moses. However, Moses was commanded to fashion the representations of the cherubim, which were not considered as idols since they came from divine dictation. So because of that, there was kind of a broad tolerance of imagery within Judaism. But there was always careful consideration not to depict the divine. The divine things were always represented instead by a hand or by the temple or the ark. But a common misconception is that images started within the last however many hundred or thousand years, but Jewish synagogues had art in them. But, like I just mentioned, they were carefully crafted so that they weren't idolistic, but rather they were just images, to beautify the temples. Now, the Romans and Greeks both had imagery as well, and with Christianity growing near these people, you can only expect that there's going to be some influence from one to the other. The main difference between this influence is the nature of the spirit of the images that they're using. Now, the earliest Christian art can be found in the catacombs. In its early years, of course, Christianity was a forbidden religion. It was persecuted, and Christians had to have tremendous faith to be Christians because they were constantly living in fear of being killed. So Christian catacombs had depictions of early martyrs and Old Testament figures such as Moses, the three youths, Noah, Abraham, and others. They also tended to depict Christ a lot in very symbolic ways, such as a shepherd or a teacher, not necessarily identifying the figure as Christ himself, but rather as more of a symbol of Christ our shepherd or Christ our teacher. Early Christian art certainly took influence from pagan traditions of the regions, but just as the traditions of the New Testament church are related but different to the traditions of the Jewish church or the Old Testament, the borrowing of art from the pagans, it's purified by its use in the church, which, according to that book, Michael Quino refers to the church as the custodian of wisdom. So it purifies these traditions and adapts them a little bit. Many of these borrowed pagan symbols are now popularly understood as symbols of the early church. The seasons are a symbol of the resurrection. A ship is a symbol of prosperity and of the church. The peacock, the dove, and the palm tree are all symbols of paradise. But in addition to these borrowed pagan symbols, the Christians also invented their own. The adoration of the wise men is a symbol of accepting pagans into the faith. The loaves and the fishes are a symbol of the Eucharist. The vine, God's grace for the baptized. And perhaps the most popular one, a fish represented Christ himself, or being Christian in general. So the church, the point of all of this is, the church from the earliest days used imagery to depict what it couldn't necessarily say in words for fear of punishment. So while the modern church is not necessarily living in that same fear of punishment, though in certain places it is happening, persecution is happening, it's clear to see the ties between the early church and the modern church, especially on the front of imagery. Now in 312, Emperor Constantine defeated Maxentius, and Christianity officially became the religion of the Byzantine Empire. You can only imagine the springs of art that welled forth, because for the first time, you didn't have to preach Christianity quietly and in the catacombs. You could do it openly. So the religious images sprung up in numerous ways, even oftentimes at the commission of the emperor. And then when Justinian became emperor in the 6th century, he commissioned the great Christian church, Hagia Sophia, although it looked like that, except it didn't have the minarets. Those were added by the Muslims after the fall of Constantinople. But Hagia Sophia was filled with beautiful iconographic mosaics. And those have been re-revealed in somewhat recent years after being covered by the Muslims after the fall of Constantinople. And these are a couple of the images from Hagia Sophia. These icons and modern icons have names inscribed on them. This is another custom that was borrowed actually from the pagans. The pagans would write names on images that they painted. The Christians took this same thing, and now it is a standard of iconography, is to have the name of the saint that's depicted. And you can see, if you're familiar at all with ancient art, you can see the resemblance that these icons have to the art of the same period from Greece, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch. There was a lot of influence drawn from the regions, and that kind of helped develop the Byzantine style. Now, going to Egypt, a little bit away from the empire, the ancient Egyptians had a custom of creating art of the dead, which was then placed on the head of the mummy as a way to identify that person and remember them. And they used a technique called encaustic, which involves mixing pigments into melted wax and then using that to paint. So Christians in this area were evangelized by St. Mark in around 70 AD, so they naturally maintained some of this influence, and they developed a similar style. One of the oldest icons is this one of Christ protecting Abbot Mena, and it's done in that encaustic style. If you're familiar with Coptic iconography, it bears somewhat of a resemblance to that. We'll look at some Coptic icons a little bit later. Another icon from this same period and in this same style is perhaps the most popular icon ever, the icon of Christ Pantocrator from the monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. This is done in that same encaustic style, And I was speaking to an art historian a couple of days ago, and he said that he's seen it in person. It's just slightly bigger than life size, and it's incredible. And in caustic, it's not a smooth texture. Because it's wax and pigments, it's kind of got a rough texture to it. So you can see that, and no pictorial representation of it really does it justice. I hope that I can see it in person sometime. An interesting side note here, this is that icon of Christ Pantocrator and then the Shroud of Turin. And you can see how closely the icon relates to the Shroud of Turin. This is evidence that even early iconographers were following some sort of tradition. They weren't just making things up and doing things as they felt like it. Now in 691, 692, the Acts of the Quintisext Council state that Christ should be depicted no longer as a lamb, which was really popular, but should be depicted in his humanity, since it's through his incarnation that we receive our salvation. And we'll touch on that. That's a big bolstering for why the Orthodox use icons. It's a reaffirmation that Christ became man for us. So, iconoclasm. It's a really big topic. I'm only going to scratch the surface here, but the rejection of icons had been somewhat ever-present, albeit sporadically, up until about the 8th century. This was provoked at points by the Muslim Arabs and the Jews in eastern provinces. But the real crisis of iconoclasm broke out when Leo III became emperor in 717. He rejected any representation of Christ and his saints, and he strongly believed that such representations should not be objects of veneration. It's understood now that his feelings toward icons were certainly influenced to a degree by numerous economic and political reasons happening kind of behind the scenes. But nonetheless, it sparked a period of time that was very difficult for the church. And it was more than just the refusal of the use of icons. Iconoclasm was rooted in a lot of fundamental heresies for the church, one of the biggest of which is the heresy of Monophysitism, or the Monophysites, who claimed that Christ's divine nature absorbed his human nature, and because of that, it wasn't appropriate to depict him in images. And the iconoclasts upheld this heresy at a council that they held in 754. Now, the church naturally resisted these heresies, but the imperial condemnation of icons resulted in mass destruction of them, including the removal of icons from churches and private homes, and that's why we don't have a lot of images of ancient icons. The ones that I showed you from Egypt were kind of protected from iconoclasm because Egypt was a little bit more far removed than the greater Constantinople and empirical area, but the Christians who upheld the use of icons and fought valiantly for them were treated as heretics. They were imprisoned, tortured, mutilated, and even killed. There are thousands of martyrs who died in defense of the holy icons. Now, there's an interesting story that I don't think when the emperor did what I'm about to tell you he did, really realized it was going to backfire so poorly for him. But there's a story that one day a monk from Nicomedia was summoned before the emperor, and the emperor said to him contemptuously, "Stupid monk, don't you see that you can walk on the image of Jesus Christ without doing any dishonor to his person?" And the monk was quick to retort, so he pulled out a coin of the emperor with his face on it, threw it on the ground, and said, "Well, in that case, I can walk on this." And the emperor's assistant stopped him, and then the emperor was put to death. So not only did the monk prove his point, but he was also granted a martyr's crown. So that's 2 points monk, 0 points emperor. The heresy of iconoclasm and the divisions that it caused hastened the decline of the Byzantine Empire. But ultimately, iconoclasm was put to rest at the Second Council of Nicaea, which was held in 787. This was the 7th of the ecumenical councils of the church. It was very decisive. The iconophiles sustained the vehemence of the iconodules, iconoclasts, not duels, excuse me, valiantly defending the good and proper use of icons with all theological bolstering. This victory resulted in the restoration of icons. This led to a final surge of violence and kind of a relapse of iconoclasm around the beginning of the 9th century under Emperor Leo V. But ultimately, the church and icons won in 843. Orthodoxy triumphed over all heresies, thanks in big part to Empress Theodora and her son Michael. And a yearly memorial of this victory was established on March 11th. It's still celebrated today by the Orthodox on the first Sunday of Great Lent, which we call the Sunday of Orthodoxy, which was just a couple weeks ago. So after 843, icons began to flourish more and more. In Italy, traditional Byzantine iconographic practices began to change with influence from the region and growing separations between Rome and the rest of the church. But even after the schism of 1054, icons in Italy remained very Byzantine in nature up until around the 13th century. This image is from St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which was a cathedral built after the schism, but you can see how closely the icons in it relate to the Byzantine style. This is another example that shows a little bit more of the Western influence, but still you can see the relations between it and the Byzantine iconographic style. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the invasion of the Balkans by the Turks, the glory of Orthodoxy in Constantinople was greatly dimmed, and the churches were converted into mosques. That's when those minarets were put up, and the icons were covered with plaster. On the far side of the screen, you can see, like I mentioned, the plaster has been removed bit by bit, but these are beautiful, gigantic mosaics, and you can imagine that plaster sticking to a bunch of pieces of broken glass and stone would be next to impossible to get off without destroying the mosaics themselves. And unfortunately, Hagia Sophia has been converted back into a mosque nowadays, and during the Muslim, when they're using it as a mosque, they still cover up the icons with sheets. So that's a great lamentation of our modern times that we're kind of relapsing into that. But around the same time as the fall of Constantinople, Kievan Rus was finally liberated from Tartar oppression, and it began to rekindle the flame of Byzantium. Patriarch Photius of Moscow and all Russia was an untiring iconophile, establishing, with the help of many Byzantine artists, many schools of iconography. One of the greatest iconographers of all time is the Russian Andrew Ritchey, who was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1988. This icon of the Trinity, the Hospitality of Abraham, is considered one of the most perfect icons ever created, and it serves as the model for Russian iconographers even to this day, and iconographers in general. You can see on the other side another example of Russian iconography. It certainly bears resemblance to the Byzantine iconography, but it develops a little bit more and starts to take on some features that are a little bit different, and some different colors and things like that. We'll jump into that a little bit later in the presentation. Now, in broad terms, the 17th century saw the greatest decadence of the icon. This is connected to the abandonment of tradition in general, resulting from ever-increasing Western influence. So icons began to look more and more like modern-day Catholic images. These images actually come from Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow, Russia, the great patriarchal cathedral. But you can see how much they look like Renaissance paintings, as opposed to Byzantine icons. And we'll get into the specifics of why icons look the way they do later in the presentation, but this is an abandonment of some of those practices, and they start to look more like pretty pictures than they do like important religious images that we use. So I told you we'd mention Coptic icons. It's a fair point to make and important to think about that the Coptic icons and their strain from the traditional Byzantine practice came about in a very similar manner as the Western influence did in those icons that we just looked at. So these are not the icons that the Orthodox use or should use. In both cases, the Western icons and Coptic icons, it's certainly appropriate to appreciate the beauty of the art. But as we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, icons are not simply a thing of beauty. And the Orthodox should not use Coptic or Western icons in our churches and homes because they abandon tradition, and the Orthodox Church is a church of tradition. Like I mentioned with the early icons in the Shroud of Turin, even from the earliest times, there was a tradition and kind of set of guidelines that people followed. So anything that has developed in somewhat recent years is obviously no longer closely linked to the early church, and the Orthodox Church upholds as much of the true faith as we believe that we uphold the true faith. So we try and uphold its practices, and abandonment of those practices in the forms of Coptic icons and Western icons is not necessarily something that aligns with the entire thinking of the Orthodox Church. So let's discuss a little bit the biblical and dogmatic foundations for the use of icons. Is Christ is Christ truly God and man, one and the same person? The affirmative answer to this question is the fundamental mystery of the Christian faith. And similarly, the icon serves as the affirmation of the incarnation. To deny the icon is to deny that Christ truly became man for our sakes. Christ himself is the perfect example of our humanity. He is the perfect icon. God made man in his image, in Greek his ikon, his icon. So we see Christ, the perfect example of humanity. He's the perfect icon of humanity. The iconoclasts argued a few key things. One big argument was that, quote, no man has ever seen God. This is a verse quoted multiple times in Scripture. However, the iconoclasts often fail to continue in John 1:18, where it says, the only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. And Christ also says, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father, right? So, no, we have not seen God, but we have seen God in the person of Jesus Christ. So, another point argued by the iconoclasts was that the icon only represents Christ in his humanity, which reaffirmed the heresy of Nestorius. He was a heretic condemned by the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. Another point from the iconoclasts, the icon represents Christ only in his divinity. Well, that's just impossible, because God cannot be depicted or represented. And this reaffirms the heresy of Arius, who was a heretic condemned by the First Council of Nicaea. And then the one that we discussed earlier, that the heresy that Christ's humanity is swallowed up in his divinity. If we're going to say this, then we're claiming that Christ had one nature instead of two, and this was a heresy that was championed by Dioscorus and condemned by the Council of Chalcedon. So, how do we theologically understand icons? Well, because God became man in the person of Jesus Christ, Mosaic law was put to an end. The New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, which reveals a true knowledge of God, liberating man from their inevitable idolatry. Some of the champions of the holy icons were St. John of Damascus, St. Theodore the Studite, and St. Nicephorus, the Patriarch of Constantinople. St. Theodore says, from the moment Christ is born of a mother who can be depicted, he naturally has an image that corresponds to that of his mother. If he could not be represented by art, this would mean that he was not born of a mother who can be depicted, but he was only born of the Father, and that he was not incarnate. But this contradicts the whole divine economy of our salvation. St. John says, I do not adore matter itself, I adore the creator of all matter, who became matter for my sake, who deigned to inhabit matter, our flesh, and who through matter accomplished my salvation. So the iconoclasts rejected the Council of Chalcedon, which clearly stated that Christ had a human and a divine nature. And in the icon of Christ, we're not seeing just his human nature or just his divine nature, but we're seeing his entirety. The icon shows us the person of the eternal Word incarnate. Logically, because the icon shares in the mystery of Christ's two natures, it embraces the spiritual presence of the being represented, and thus it can become the object of our veneration. We are not venerating any of the visible material elements, but we're venerating the person depicted. And the bond between the icon and its prototype, the person it's modeled after, doesn't necessarily mean they have to be identical. It depends on the representation of the person whose name is inscribed on the icon, so that, quote, the honor rendered to the image passes to its prototype, a quote from St. Basil the Great at the Second Council of Nicaea. So an icon is just like a picture of your grandma. If I took a picture of your grandma, I ripped it up, I spit on it, I threw it on the ground and I stomped on it, you'd be offended, right? Right? No, instead, we cherish pictures of our loved ones. We hold them and we kiss them, especially when we desire to be with them and we're not able to. We don't love the paper or the ink. That's not what we're kissing. We love the person and we're kissing them. And this is exactly how we understand icons. We love the people depicted and we long to be with them. If there had been cameras when Christ was alive, wouldn't we all have taken pictures of him and hung them up in our homes? Of course we would have. So St. Theodore says, nowhere did Christ order that even the briefest word be written about him. Nonetheless, his image was sketched in writing by the apostles and preserved for us to the present. So, what is represented on the one hand with paper and ink is likewise represented on the other hand with the icon and with its various colors and different materials. Despite being without form, quality, quantity, or body, Christ took on all of these characteristics for our salvation. So it's only fitting that we use such things of form, quantity, quality, and body to depict him, that those who are seeking to be like him, as we all should, if we're truly Christians, might ever have the image of their model before them. So within our daily life, obviously icons are important in the life of Christians, but within the daily life, which for a Christian really begins at their baptism, icons are an ever-present thing. From the earliest time, at the baptism, a Christian is often given an icon of the patron saint whose name that he or she receives. At marriage, the couple is traditionally blessed with an icon set of Christ and his mother by the fathers of the couple. At the funeral, the baptismal icon and that of the Theotokos, the Mother of God, are traditionally carried before the body in the procession. Now it's being slow on me. There we go. Icons adorn the houses of Christians just like pictures of our loved ones do. Whom are we called to love more than anyone? God. So we should have pictures of him, of Christ, just as we have pictures of our family. And in very traditional terms, the icon should be greeted, it should be venerated, just as the head of the household is when you go to someone else's house. And sometimes, in really, really traditional terms, even before you greet the family, you go and venerate the icon. Now within the church, icons adorn the walls, showing us the family of saints, the, quote, great cloud of witnesses we have to serve as our examples. How can you feel alone when you're surrounded by so many people who are extending their hands to help you achieve the goals that they've already achieved? The icons in the church and icons in general depict heavenly things and perfected things, not anything earthly. And the church itself is an image of the cosmic order. The ground level represents the earth, the vaulted dome represents heaven, and the sanctuary, the altar area, unites them both. Now from the 9th century onward, and note that that's before the schism, there were official rules that dictated what icons are to be painted on the walls and ceilings of the church. Christ Pantocrator, the maker of all, that big icon you can see up there, occupies the space in the dome, showing us a window into heaven. Behind the sanctuary, the altar area, is the image of the Theotokos, called Platitero, which means more spacious, a reference to her being more spacious than the heavens. She is our bridge between heaven and earth, and surrounding her are the angels like a protecting wall. On the back wall of the church are traditionally the icon of the Last Judgment or of the Dormition, the funeral of the Virgin Mary, which serve as reminders to the faithful as they exit the church of things that are inevitably going to happen to them. We're all going to die and we're all going to be judged. So keep that in mind as you go about and go out of the church and back into the world. And the rest of the space in the church is filled from scenes of the life of Christ and of his saints. An interesting story about Kiev and Rus and Russia becoming Christian. When Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev, who baptized all of Rus, sent his stewards to find his choice of faith, they returned from Constantinople with the words, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We do not know what we ought to tell you, but one thing we know well. For assuredly on earth such beauty cannot be found anywhere else. There God dwells among men who celebrate his glory in such a manner that no other religion on this earth could equal. It is impossible for us to forget such splendorous beauty." So remember that Hagia Sophia was adorned floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with icons, the window into heaven. And Orthodox worship achieves beauty in all of the senses. Our eyes see the beautiful icons, our noses smell the fragrant and sweet odor of the incense, our taste is satisfied by the Holy Eucharist, our touch is satisfied by the veneration of the icons and other holy objects, and our hearing by the melodious hymns singing praises to God. Now an interesting note that Kino makes in his book is that oil painting and organ music, which were developed about the same time as each other, offer their senses very sensual and carnal colors and sounds, as opposed to these kind of heavenly ones. And these are elements that are very far from the icons. But the ultimate point of all of that, and me telling you that story, is these people said they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth. And they went into a building that was covered in icons. So the church, when it's filled with icons, is heaven on earth. And if we want to be as close as possible to God and as close as possible to heaven, then we're going to find it in the church adorned with icons. Now finally, within the church, the iconostasis is adorned with icons of Christ, his mother, the apostles, feast, angels, and other saints. And this serves, it stands between the altar area and the nave of the church. But it's not necessarily a barrier, it's rather the maximal expression of everything that the icon can reveal to us. Behind the iconostasis, there's nothing really more to be seen, since the mystery that takes place there is not comprehensible by human senses, but only by the soul in communion. So, before we jump into understanding the form, we'll take a little break, and then we'll talk about what can actually be seen.